Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we cut through the noise and get straight to the insights you need to navigate our complex world. Today, we're tackling a challenge that, well, it's become increasingly fundamental and, frankly, quite pervasive in our daily digital lives. It's this inherent need we all have to place, immense trust in powerful, often opaque intermediaries for our most sensitive information, our private communications, and, of course, our financial transactions. Every single time you send money online or share a personal photo or even just browse a website, you are implicitly trusting a company, a server, some centralized system with your data and your interactions.
That's exactly right. And this reliance, this dependence on central points of control, it creates vulnerabilities we often don't even think about. Not until something goes really wrong anyway. And that brings up a crucial question. What if there was a completely different way to do things? What if you could interact online, send valuable assets, maybe even truly own a piece of the digital networks you use every single day, all without relying on a single potentially vulnerable third-party company or, singular point of control?
Precisely. And that's the core question guiding our deep dive today, because this isn't just about digital money, which, let's be honest, is often the headline people see. This is about something much bigger, a profound, fundamental shift in our entire digital infrastructure. We're going to unpack Bitcoin, explore the revolutionary potential of the underlying blockchain technology, and then we'll expand into the expansive vision of Web3. Our mission here is simple. Cut through all the jargon, all the buzzwords, and explore why these technologies aren't just a passing fad, why they're actually designed to fundamentally reshape how we interact online, and, maybe most importantly, how they address critical, sometimes catastrophic, points of failure in today's increasingly centralized systems.
Absolutely. And to do that, we've synthesized insights from some truly powerful sources. In particular, we've drawn heavily from excerpts of a fantastic YouTube video. It's titled "The Greatest Bitcoin Explanation of All Time in Under 10 Minutes." Quite a claim, right? From the Altcoin Daily channel. And this video features two really brilliant minds who truly illuminate these complex topics. Peter Van Valkenburg, who is the director of research at the Coin Center, and Brian Brooks, who you might know as the former United States acting controller of the currency. Their perspectives are just incredibly valuable for understanding the past, present, and future of this whole digital evolution.
Okay, let's dive in then. Let's unpack this by starting with the most basic question, right? It's one that still confuses a lot of people, I think, even those who kind of follow this space. What is Bitcoin? I mean, we hear the name constantly. It's always in the news, but what exactly are we talking about here?
Right. So at its most fundamental level, Bitcoin is simply the world's first true cryptocurrency. And what makes it work, what enables it to actually function, is that it operates on the world's first public blockchain network. So, okay, if we boil it down, what does Bitcoin actually do? It sounds almost deceptively simple, but it's profoundly powerful. Bitcoin just lets you, any individual, anywhere in the world, send and receive value. We can think of that as digital money, right, to and from anyone else globally. And the astounding part, the really key part, is that all you need is a computer and an internet connection. That's basically it.
Huh, that's it.
Yeah, there's no requirement for a traditional bank account. No need for a payment processor like PayPal or Venmo. No governmental body standing in between you and the person you're transacting with. It's a peer-to-peer system. It completely cuts out those intermediaries.
Okay, and this is where it gets really interesting for me. Because that basic function, sending value, it sounds almost too straightforward, doesn't it? I mean, we've been sending money over the internet for decades now using various services. So what makes this specific functionality, the seemingly simple act, what makes it so revolutionary? What's the fundamental breakthrough here?
It's revolutionary precisely because of that no middleman aspect. That's the core. Think about literally every other way you currently send money online. Every single one. You always rely on some kind of trusted intermediary, whether it's your big high street bank or a payment service like PayPal, Square, Venmo, whatever, or even just your credit card company. There's always a centralized entity that facilitates and verifies that transaction.
Right. Someone sitting in the middle taking a cut or at least watching.
Exactly. Bitcoin fundamentally changes that whole paradigm. It operates without needing you to trust any of those third parties. The key insight, and Peter Van Valkenburg really highlights this well, is the complete lack of any corporation or centralized authority sitting between the sender and the receiver. So this means Bitcoin isn't just, another digital payment app. It is, in effect, the world's first truly public digital payments infrastructure.
Okay, hang on. When you use the word public there, you're not talking about something run by the government, are you? You mean public, like a public park, available to everyone.
Precisely. Not government-owned. By public, I simply mean it's available to all. It is not owned, it's not controlled, it's not subject to the whims of any single private entity, nor is it dependent on a specific country or government. Let's use an analogy to make it clear. Think about the internet itself. We already have public infrastructure for information, right? Websites, email, that's the internet. It's a shared global network, universally available to pretty much anyone with a connection. No single company owns the internet.
Right, okay, I get that.
But before Bitcoin came along, the only truly public payments infrastructure we had was physical cash. Dollars, euros, yen, whatever. And the major, really obvious limitation with cash, of course, is that it only really works well in face-to-face transactions. You can't easily email someone a $20 bill, right? And you certainly can't send physical cash across oceans instantly without dealing with significant hurdles, fees, or delays.
Okay, so if I'm following you, before Bitcoin, if I wanted to pay someone remotely, like not standing right in front of them, maybe across town or across the country or even internationally, I was always, like, by definition, forced to rely on some kind of private infrastructure. My bank, probably, or maybe a whole chain of banks working together in the background.
Precisely. If you wanted to pay someone remotely, whether you did it over the phone back in the day or over the internet now, you had absolutely no alternative but to use private infrastructure. You'd basically instruct your bank, hey, open up your internal books, your ledger, debit my account for this amount, and credit the person I'm trying to pay. Now, if you both happen to use the same bank, okay, the process might seem relatively straightforward. But even then, you're still relying entirely on that single bank's centralized system and their records. More often, though, you and the recipient use different banks.
Yeah, usually.
And in that case, multiple private banks and multiple different ledger entries get involved behind the scenes, each one adding a layer of necessary trust, potential friction, bottlenecks, and often fees as well.
Okay, so how does Bitcoin change that specific process?
With Bitcoin, that entire complex, multi-layered system is streamlined and, crucially, decentralized. The ledger, the book of accounts, is the public blockchain itself. It's shared, it's transparent, it's distributed across thousands of computers worldwide. Anyone can add an entry to that ledger, which basically just records the transfer of their Bitcoins to someone else's address. And the entire decentralized network of participants verifies that transaction using cryptography. And here's the kicker, the really empowering part, I think. Anyone, absolutely anyone, regardless of their nationality, their race, their religion, gender, sex, or even their creditworthiness, can create a Bitcoin address for absolutely zero cost, instantly. That means they can receive payments digitally from anywhere in the world directly without asking anyone's permission.
Wow. So no gatekeepers.
No gatekeepers. This democratizes access to digital finance in a way that has simply never been possible before. It effectively positions Bitcoin as the world's first truly globally accessible public money.
Now, let's be real for a second, because no groundbreaking technology just pops up fully formed and perfect on day one. Bitcoin isn't flawless, is it? I mean, you can't use it everywhere yet. And the price, well, it jumps around quite a bit.
No, you're absolutely right. It's certainly not perfect, and it's really crucial to acknowledge that upfront. Think about the early days of email, maybe, when it was first invented back in, 1972. It wasn't instantly adopted by everyone, right? It had its quirks, its limitations. It definitely wasn't the seamless communication tool we rely on today. Bitcoin is kind of similar in its current stage of development. It isn't necessarily the best money on every single metric right now. For instance, like you said, it's not yet accepted everywhere you go in the physical world, although that's changing slowly. It's not often used to quote prices for, your daily coffee or groceries.
Yeah.
And yes, its value can fluctuate quite significantly, sometimes wildly, which means it's not always a stable store of value, especially in the short term. These are definitely real challenges that the technology and its whole ecosystem are still actively working to address.
But despite those current limitations you just laid out, the sheer fact that it works at all, that it functions consistently globally without needing any of those trusted intermediaries we talked about, that's still the real breakthrough here, isn't it? That fundamental shift in the trust model, the ability to transact directly peer-to-peer, that's what makes it so groundbreaking.
Absolutely, 100%. The mere fact that it functions, that it reliably facilitates the transfer of value across the globe without any central authority. No single corporation, no government sitting in the middle controlling things. It's truly amazing when you stop and think about it. It really represents a profound computer science breakthrough. And its implications, as Peter Van Valkenburg argues in the source, could be as significant for individual freedom, for global prosperity, and just for human flourishing, as the birth of the internet itself was. And Bitcoin is really just the beginning, It's a powerful proof of concept. If we can successfully replace privately owned payments infrastructure with something public and decentralized, then we start to open the door to replacing other pervasive private choke points.
Hmm.
Those bottlenecks that currently restrict human interaction in countless ways all across the digital realm. This really opens up a whole new world of possibilities for how we interact online.
Right. So moving beyond just money.
Exactly. What's fascinating here is kind of extend our thinking beyond just financial payments. If Bitcoin has shown us, proven really, that we can create public, decentralized alternatives to private payments infrastructure, then it naturally leads us to consider the possibility, and I'd argue the vital need, to replace other critical private choke points that hinder human interaction. This speaks to a much
Okay, so this raises a really crucial set of questions then for us and for you listening. Why should we as a society even want to build more public digital infrastructure? I mean, the private stuff often works okay, right? Why should we embrace blockchains and these decentralized networks over the existing corporate intermediaries that we're all just so used to? Why should we tolerate their current inefficiencies? Because let's be honest, the tech is still young, sometimes it's clunky, and why should we actively put in the work to make them better? And maybe from a national interest perspective, why is it important that the pioneers, the innovators in this space, stay here, in places like the US, rather than being forced to move overseas because of regulatory uncertainty?
Yeah, those are all critical questions. And the simple, compelling, and I think increasingly urgent reason is this. The corporate intermediaries that currently provide so much of our critical but privately owned digital infrastructure, they're becoming fewer, larger, and consequently far, far more powerful. And as they continue to consolidate control over our data, our communications, our financial lives, their failures when they happen become increasingly grave. They impact more and more people with potentially catastrophic consequences. This concentration of power, even if it's in the hands of companies that mean well, it inevitably creates dangerous single points of failure.
And we've unfortunately seen those consequences play out in some truly alarming ways just over the last few years. Our sources really detail this vividly. Let's maybe look at some specific, quite chilling examples they mention. Take the Equifax data breach. Do you remember that? Back in 2017, roughly half of all Americans, that's a staggering 143 million people, had their social security numbers, probably the most sensitive personal identifier we have, exposed to hackers. And this happened because of a data breach at just one company, one credit reporting agency, Equifax. It's just a textbook example of a catastrophic single point of failure in our personal data infrastructure.
It really is. And the problem isn't just confined to personal data, is it? Consider the SWIFT network. Now, that's the secure messaging system that basically forms the backbone for almost all international bank transfers. It's supposed to be incredibly secure, impenetrable even. Yet the network has relayed hundreds of millions of dollars in fraudulent transactions over the years. Now, this wasn't necessarily due to a fundamental flaw in SWIFT itself, but rather because of hacks at member banks, the individual banks connected to the network, in places like Bangladesh, Vietnam, Ecuador, Russia. The FBI even suspects North Korea was behind the largest of these particular attacks.
Wow. So the weakness was at the edges at the connected banks.
Exactly. The core vulnerability here is that while SWIFT itself might be somewhat decentralized in its structure of participants, the individual member banks are still centralized points of trust. And if they get compromised, the whole system connected through them is put at risk. In another particularly egregious instance mentioned in the source, corrupt, low-level employees at an Indian bank, Punjab National Bank, they were somehow able to fraudulently certify SWIFT messages. They basically faked the authorizations, and this allowed them to effectively steal an astonishing $1.8 billion. That's not just a big bank robbery, as the source points out. It was the largest electronic bank robbery in history. These are all instances where a centralized point of trust, whether it was an internal bank ledger or a connection point to a larger system, was compromised, leading to massive systemic losses.
And it's crystal clear this isn't just about financial systems either, right? The vulnerability extends right into our core information infrastructure. I think many of us remember October 2016, when an estimated 1.2 million internet-connected devices, things like webcams, DVRs, were hacked. They were turned into this massive botnet army. And this botnet then launched a huge distributed denial of service, a DDoS attack. It made prominent websites like CNN, Fox News, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal just completely unavailable across huge parts of Europe and North America for several hours. That really demonstrated just how fragile even our public-facing information infrastructure can be when those centralized points of control or reliance are targeted.
Absolutely. And this vulnerability, this risk, it only intensifies with the rapid expansion of the Internet of Things, the IoT. That's where more and more physical machines, everyday objects are being connected to the internet. Your smart fridge, your thermostat, your car. These devices often rely heavily on centralized servers owned and maintained by private intermediaries just to function properly or to transmit their data back.
Yeah.
And we've seen real-world hacks that are, frankly, truly unsettling and highlight the very real physical dangers involved. Consider this. Pacemakers made by St. Jude's Hospital have been identified as being potentially hackable. Baby monitors from a company called TrendNet have been compromised, allowing complete strangers to observe children in their homes. And perhaps most dramatically, Jeeps have been remotely commandeered by researchers, thankfully, and driven off the road, putting lives in direct danger.
That is terrifying.
It is. Imagine the implications of someone malicious remotely taking control of your car while you're driving, or your home security system, or even more critically, a medical device implanted in your body. The physical world is becoming increasingly susceptible to these digital single points of failure.
So the core takeaway here, the main message, seems to be that those vulnerabilities aren't just unfortunate incidents or bad luck. They are fundamentally, almost structurally, inescapable in any system that has single points of failure built into its design. And it truly doesn't matter if that single point of failure is a massive, seemingly trustworthy corporation like Equifax, or maybe even a government agency. The inherent problem isn't really who owns the choke point, but simply that a choke point exists in the first place. It's an architectural flaw, you could say.
Exactly right. And this problem of centralized choke points, it isn't actually new. It's kind of a historical pattern we see repeating. Before the internet really took off, similar choke points existed in mass communication. If you wanted to deliver a message to a broad audience back then, you were effectively forced to go through one of only 3 major television broadcasters, or maybe a handful of powerful national newspapers. These were private corporations, yes, and they were essential at the time for disseminating information. But they held immense centralized power over what could be communicated and by whom. Now, private corporations are, of course, essential for innovation, for providing services, for economic growth. Nobody's denying that. But no critical infrastructure, especially infrastructure that serves the public good, should ever rely on just 1 or 2 such entities. Diversity of control, resilience through distribution, these are really key principles for robust systems.
And the internet itself, as it developed, dramatically removed many of those single points of failure in the communications infrastructure, didn't it? Instead of just, 3 TV channels dominating the airwaves, suddenly we got millions of websites, an explosion of blogs, eventually countless social media platforms. And this ushered in an incredible wave of competition among new media corporations, all building on top of the internet's open public rails. It wasn't really about replacing private companies entirely, but more about creating an open, permissionless base layer, a foundation that allowed for unprecedented innovation and, importantly, distributed control at the application layer of the websites and services we actually use.
Precisely. And this is exactly where blockchain technology and the broader concept of decentralization comes back into the picture. They can potentially do for payments and other critical infrastructure what the internet did for communication. They can similarly disintermediate critical payments infrastructure, and as we discussed, potentially even the rapidly expanding Internet of Things infrastructure. Now, is the technology fully mature yet? No, absolutely not. It certainly isn't ready to answer all of those complex questions and challenges today, but as the source material argues, it represents our single best hope right now for building a more resilient, more secure, and ultimately maybe more democratic digital future. And just as with the early internet back in the 1990s, where a relatively light-touch regulatory approach allowed it to blossom, we probably need a similar pro-innovation policy framework today to ensure that these powerful new innovations can truly take root and flourish. Ideally, here in places committed to freedom and innovation for the benefit and security of all citizens. This kind of proactive, thoughtful approach can help steer the development of these powerful new systems in the right direction, fostering a truly robust and decentralized digital commons for everyone.
Okay, so looking ahead then, as we think about this potential future, what does all of this really mean for the very nature of the internet itself? How we use it, how we interact with it? Brian Brooks, who we mentioned earlier, the former comptroller of the currency, he has a really powerful way of explaining the evolution of the internet and where we might be headed with this whole concept of Web3. It really puts everything into a clear perspective, I think.
Yes, his breakdown is incredibly insightful. It really simplifies what is actually a complex technological and societal shift into these easily digestible stages. He talks about 3 distinct eras of the internet, each one kind of building upon the last while also trying to address its limitations. So first, there was Web 1. He characterizes this as the read-only internet. If you remember your very first America Online, your AOL account maybe, or browsing those very first websites back in the 1990s, it was very much like looking into a curated walled garden, as he puts it. Content was presented to you, much like reading articles in a traditional magazine or a newspaper. You could consume it, you could read it, but you couldn't really interact with it in a meaningful way or contribute your own content easily. It was largely static, non-interactive, mostly a one-way broadcast of information.
Right. So basically, during Web 1, we were all pretty much passive consumers, weren't we? Just viewing what was put in front of us by these early internet gatekeepers like AOL. There wasn't really much of an avenue for user-generated content or genuine interaction.
Exactly. You were primarily a spectator. Then came Web 2. This is the era Brooks calls the read and write internet. And this era truly exploded in the late 1990s, especially the early 2000s, with the rise of things like the blogosphere, online forums, and eventually, of course, social media platforms. Suddenly, users couldn't just read content. They could actively create, publish, and share their own stuff. Think about platforms like MySpace, then Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, all the big names we know today. This was a massive leap forward in terms of user participation and interaction. It changed everything. However, and this is the critical flaw of Web 2, according to Brooks and many others, all of this user-generated activity, all of our content, our personal data, our online interactions, it was ultimately monetized and centralized by a very, very small number of incredibly powerful companies. You know who they are? Google, Facebook, now Meta, Twitter, now X, Amazon, Apple. A handful of tech giants. You were creating the content, driving the engagement, but you didn't truly own the platform you were creating it on. Nor did you fully control your own data or how it was being used, tracked, and often sold to advertisers. These massive platforms effectively built their multi-billion-dollar empires on the back of your content and your attention.
Okay, and that brings us right up to the present. And this idea of Web 3. This is where it gets truly transformative, potentially, isn't it? The fundamental shift from just reading and writing on someone else's platform to actually having ownership of the digital infrastructure itself.
Yes, absolutely. Web 3 is fundamentally different from its predecessors because it introduces the ability for users to own the actual network they're interacting with. Crypto assets themselves, the tokens associated with these networks, are designed at their core to represent an ownership stake in that underlying network, rather than just being, say, a digital currency for payments. Let's use that metaphor we talked about preparing. It was quite good. If Web 1 was like being given a book to read, and Web 2 was like being given a pen to write in someone else's notebook, then Web 3 is like being given a digital key. And this key doesn't just let you read or write. It allows you to actually own a piece of the notebook itself.
Own the notebook.
Exactly. And often, more than that, this digital key, this token, grants you the ability to vote on the notebook's future. You get a say in how it develops, what rules it operates by, how it's governed. So you're not just a user anymore, or just a content creator renting space. You become a stakeholder, an owner, and an active participant in the governance of the network itself.
That's a really clear and, frankly, compelling distinction. It changes the whole relationship. So when we talk about something specific like Layer 1 tokens in this Web 3 context, what does that actually mean in terms of this ability to own the network? How does that work in practice?
Okay, so Layer 1 tokens are essentially the foundational cryptocurrencies of the core blockchain networks themselves. Think Bitcoin, BTC, for the Bitcoin blockchain, or Ether, for the Ethereum network. These are the base layers. And these tokens fundamentally represent your reward for providing the essential services that keep that specific network running smoothly and securely. Think of them as your compensation, your payment for providing the ledger maintenance services, the computational power for validation, the security. All the work that back on Web 1 and especially Web 2 was performed entirely by giant centralized corporations like Google or Amazon Web Services, often without any direct compensation or ownership stake flowing back to you, the user.
Right. They did the work, they owned the servers, they reaped the rewards.
Exactly. Now, instead of Google solely owning and maintaining all that critical network infrastructure, ordinary people, individuals living in, say, a small town like Pueblo, Colorado, as Brian Brooks uses in his example, they can actually own a piece of the global Ethereum network simply by holding its native Ether tokens and perhaps participating in its operation, like staking. This is a massive fundamental departure from the current internet, which, as we discussed, is almost exclusively owned and controlled by Google, Meta, Amazon, and just a handful of other massive companies. The entire project of crypto, particularly Web 3, is really about enabling individuals like you and me to directly own, help govern, and potentially benefit from the very networks that have these native digital assets supporting them.
Okay, that clarifies layer one. But when we hear the broader term digital assets, which seems to be used all the time now, are we always talking about the same kind of thing, or are there different types with different functions or purposes within this Web3 ecosystem?
No, that's a great question. Not all digital assets are created equal, though they often serve a similar underlying purpose of providing, as one of our sources nicely puts it, the keys to open up the ledger for you to participate. We can broadly distinguish between, say, two main categories that are really relevant to this specific discussion about network ownership and control. First, you have those protocol layer tokens, the layer ones we just discussed, like Bitcoin, BTC, or Ether, ETH. These are the foundational tokens. If you're a Bitcoin miner, for instance, you're doing that intensive computational work, the proof of work, to secure the network and validate transactions. The Bitcoin you receive as a reward for that work is your direct ownership stake in that network. It's literally a piece of the Bitcoin blockchain itself, represented digitally. Similarly, the Ether token represents an ownership stake and the right to participate, maybe through staking or paying transaction fees, in the Ethereum network.
Okay, protocol layer tokens. Got it. What's the other category?
Then, built on top of these foundational layer 1 networks, you have application layer tokens. These are tokens associated with specific decentralized applications, or DApps, that are built to run on the underlying blockchain networks. It's kind of like how the apps on your smartphone depend on the underlying network, the cellular network, or the internet provided by your ISP, to actually operate and function. So people will naturally make judgments, right? They'll decide which underlying protocol layer network, maybe Ethereum, maybe Solana, maybe others they believe is most likely to succeed, to scale, to attract developers and users. And they will invest in the native tokens of that network. It's somewhat similar, Brooks suggests, to how you might have invested in Google stock back in the day, because you believe Google would successfully scale access to and build services on top of the original internet protocols like TCP/IP. But with Web3, the key difference is you can own a piece of the underlying network itself, not just shares in a single company built on top of it.
Okay, here's where it gets, I think, truly revolutionary, though, and maybe a bit mind-bending compared to traditional finance. With traditional stocks in a company like Google, your ownership usually translates to maybe some financial returns if the stock goes up, and perhaps a shareholder vote once a year on very broad corporate policies. Pretty limited influence, really. But on a decentralized network, especially one that uses something like a proof of stake consensus mechanism, the power dynamic seems totally different, right?
Mhm.
You mentioned people can actually vote on what happens in the future of the network itself. How does that directly translate to real control?
Exactly. You've hit on the core distinction and really the true essence of what decentralization aims to achieve. On a proof-of-stake network, for example, which is becoming increasingly common if you hold the network's native tokens and choose to stake them, basically locking them up to help secure the network, you can often actively participate in governing that network directly. This means you potentially have a direct say in its future development path, any proposed upgrades to the code, critical rule changes, maybe even how its community treasury funds are allocated. It's like direct democratic participation, but happening at the protocol level, embedded in the technology itself. With a proof-of-work token like Bitcoin, your participation looks a bit different. You get rewarded for maintaining the ledger through the energy-intensive process of mining. Your financial stake and influence in the network are tied more directly to that work and the value of the asset you earn. Governance is often more informal, driven by miners, developers, and users. But the crucial message here, and Brian Brooks really emphasizes this point, is that what happens on the decentralized internet, on these Web3 networks, is ultimately decided collectively by the investors, the token holders, the community, whether it's through direct participation in on-chain voting or maybe by delegating their voting power to representatives they trust. And this is in stark contrast to what happens on the main internet today, right? Where decisions about things like content moderation, censorship, data usage policies, platform rules, even who gets kicked off the platform entirely. Those decisions are unilaterally made by Twitter or X, Facebook, Meta, Google, and that small handful of other incredibly powerful centralized companies. That fundamental shift in control, empowering the broad community of users and owners rather than a few corporate gatekeepers, that is the very nature of true decentralization that Web3 is striving to deliver.
What an incredible journey we've taken today. Seriously. From really understanding Bitcoin not just as some kind of weird digital currency, but as the world's first truly public digital money, to recognizing the inherent dangers, the sometimes catastrophic potential of those centralized choke points that dominate our current digital infrastructure. And then finally exploring this groundbreaking, maybe still nascent concept of Web3, where you, the individual user, can actually own a piece of the digital networks you rely on every single day and maybe even participate directly in their governance. It's just a completely different paradigm, isn't it, for how we interact with technology and potentially with each other online in the future.
It really is. And, this raises an important and I think quite profound question for you, the listener, to ponder as you go about your digital life. Considering the significant vulnerabilities we've discussed in our current centralized systems, the very real, sometimes devastating, catastrophic failures we've already witnessed, and then weighing that against the transformative promise, however imperfectly realized so far, of decentralized ownership and control offered by Web3. What does your relationship with digital services and with the very infrastructure of the internet itself, what do you want it to look like in the years to come? How much ownership, how much control do you truly want to have over your digital interactions, your personal data, and the future evolution of the web itself? It's really a fundamental shift in how we might need to think about the digital world, moving perhaps from just being passive consumers to becoming active participants, stakeholders, and owners.
Definitely something to truly mull over as these technologies continue to evolve all around us, whether we're paying attention or not. Okay, that's all the time we have for this deep dive. Remember to follow, like, and please share this discussion with anyone you think needs to understand the future of digital interaction a little better. And of course, for more invaluable insights on these topics and many others, be sure to follow What Bitcoin Taught Me pretty much everywhere. We're on Twitter, X, Nostr, Bluesky, Threads, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Just search for What Bitcoin Taught Me. Wow, thanks for diving deep with us today.